We do hope and pray that whatever you'll be sharing this morning, reviewing with us, it will be a source of blessing to each member listening, present this morning, and those joining on this platform. And it will help us, our members, and to shape our minds and our hearts so that it will better understanding and establish faith. Once again, we welcome you, Elder Parminder, and also the members and those joining in this morning. And I hope and pray that it will be a blessing to everyone this morning. And okay, so without delay, I give this time to Elder Parminder. Pinaka, and thank you.
I want to welcome everybody to the final presentation for this camp meeting. Let's open with a word of prayer. Holy God, we thank you for all that you have done for us, not only through our lives, but especially here at this camp meeting. We ask that you would continue to show us the path that you want us to follow, a path that is laid out in prophecy. But we need to be guided along that path. for it is straight and narrow, and it's a path that's not easy to follow. We acknowledge our weakness and our frailty. We pray that you would give us strength, that we might come together in unity to understand your will for us. In Jesus' name, amen. In my first presentation, we spent our time trying to address questions that people had sent in regarding the first two presentations of this camp meeting. Those were the two presentations that Elder Terry did. I've had further questions since then. I've had further questions since then. So most of the questions seem to revolve around the issue of angels that was discussed. I'm surprised that people have focused so much about these angels as opposed to the main elements that I think Elder Terry wanted to bring forth during this camp meeting. So I might field a couple of more questions on the angels, but I don't want to focus on them in this presentation. Because it seemed to me the focus of her attention was to explain the relationship between the rise of the United States and the fall of Russia. And the vehicle that she used to do that was going back to previous studies that we have done in the movement more than a decade ago. So I just want to field some questions on that subject. So often when we do a study, we speak about first and second witnesses. So someone's asked a question. Marking the death of the King of the South at the close of probation, do we have other witnesses? So if I could ask Elder Terry how she would address that question. When we speak about other witnesses, Often it's hard to know what's in the mind of the questioner. Because I guess we'd want to know what this person is understanding the first witness to be. In order to provide other witnesses. I also want to add one more point before Elder Terry speaks. This issue about witnesses, I think many people misunderstand. Often what people do is have an idea. They are unable to defend that idea or that model. So I'll just call it weak. And in order to strengthen that, they look for another witness. And I think I've spoken on this subject many times before. Because what's the problem with that scenario that I've just laid out? What's the mistake that has happened? Anybody remember or have any thoughts? So the problem is when you have a weak first witness or a model, and then you try to find another, we'll call it a witness, that's the term we use. That supposed second witness ends up becoming the first witness. So you don't have two witnesses in the way that you think you do. If you're going to develop a thesis, have a model, you have to be pretty sure that that model has integrity. And once you're confident that that model, I'm just going to say, is strong, that appears to work, that becomes your first witness. And then you go to a second witness that is independent, but related in some way. And that second witness says or demonstrates the same information. And I think that's how you're supposed to use, on the testimony of two, a thing that's established. What you can't do is have some vague idea and then look for a model that defends that vague idea. Because that defense is not a true second witness. So I'm not saying the questioner has made that mistake. But I just think it's a worthy reminder for all of us. So the questioner is asking, do you have other witnesses about the death of the King of the South at the close of probation? I was almost tempted to answer this one, but I'd let you. Go ahead.
Think the world is mystery Babylon and go back to ancient Babylon. Ancient Babylon conquered three geographical areas and the last one is Egypt.
So Elder Terry said that the defense was given in the presentation yesterday. Which is why I thought even I could answer that one. So I don't want to put words in her mouth. And I'm not saying I'm correct. But for me, the way I would approach this about witnesses and models and stories to demonstrate something is specifically this question. Where would your first witness be? You're living in the world today and you see what's happening and you're not sure what's going on. So what would you do? Sorry? History? Everybody said history? Any other suggestions? First angel's message. So all of those answers are good. History, first angel. So the problem is, let's assume that I'm a Seventh-day Adventist. We'll start with that platform or that foundation. There are plenty of people who claim to be angels or have these special messages. And history seems a seductive way of understanding what's happening. When people say history, which Bible passage have you gone to? Isaiah? Isaiah 46. So we discussed this in a recent presentation, I think. So if we were just to simply draw Isaiah 46, how does that work? So I'll draw a line. Shout out loud. So someone said declaring the end from the beginning. So that's correct, but we need to explain it in a slightly different way. How many waymarks do you have in this story of Isaiah? Someone said 5, 2. I remember having this discussion in France in 2019, I think, and I had the same answers. I'm going to go with 3. Does that help? Just say no if it doesn't help. I'll carry on. No. Okay. So we'll call this the past. So say it, there you go. Past. Past, present, and future. And you are here. And in order to understand the future, you need to go to the past. Because the end was declared at the beginning. So that's the model that we use to try to understand prophecy. So what's built into all of this? There's just another piece of information that's built into this model. Something is happening in the present. Because if something wasn't happening today, which past are you going to look at? Because there's hundreds of pasts to look at. Does that make sense? So you have to be able to see something today. Current news. Did someone say? So it's internal? External, yes. So something is happening in the world that you can see. And based upon that, you'll go back into the past and it will predict the future. So to me, another element of all of this is there's a relationship between the present and the future. And the present and the past. All three are the same event, if we can put it that way. Does that make sense? So often we call this, in terms of Ellen White's writing, if we said this was the Sunday law, what would we call this? So we would call this the agitation. And in the movement, we've said the agitation is what's happening in the world that has all the characteristics of what's going to happen in the future. Okay, so we're living here. And what history do we want to go to? What story do we want to go to develop a first witness for the King of the South? A story that has Sunday laws in it. What's the Sunday law got to do with the death of the King of the South? They may have the same characteristics. Okay, so I'm going to suggest that if we jump a few steps in our journey of discovery, that we would go to Daniel 11. So in Daniel 11, you see a story laid out which is both a prophecy and history. And because the verses are laid out quite clearly, we can be confident in the structure. Are we okay with that? Once you get your symbols correct, you see that there's a war that's going on between two armies. And once that war happens, then the battle moves on, or the war moves on to other territories. He shall also enter into the glorious land after something has already happened. Now, the problem with those 6 verses, what is the problem? Not only with those 6 verses, with any verses. Sorry? So it doesn't give details. We know it's some history, some event, but it's all clouded in symbology. So people have got different ideas what that story means. But we know one thing about the structure. And everybody, even if you don't understand what it means, you can see that structure. And what is that structure? What can we all see, even if you don't agree on what the symbols mean? If I don't say, go ahead. There's a beginning and the end. If I don't use the word structure, but I use the word steps, which is dangerous because now I'm leading you down a path. If I change from structure to steps, now you're going to get bias built in. How many steps are there? How many? 7 steps. Or 3 steps. We'll go with 3 steps. There's a battle between 2 armies. Verse 40. Once the battle is done, then the victor moves on to another territory called the glorious land. And when that's dealt with, then what happens? There's a third territory. And the rest of it is details after that. So what I want to say is, those verses have all the properties of being a proper first witness. And that's what this movement has been built on. We may not have understood things. We may have forgotten things. But you could go to anyone in the world and just say, read those verses and tell me what it means. And I think everybody would have to agree that there are 3 steps. Are we okay with that? I think that's the first witness. Now we can guess at what those symbols mean. Who is the north? Who is the south? How do you work those things out? What's the glorious land? And what's Egypt? Because historically, Egypt is the king of the south. And so you could argue that by the time you get to verse 42, you've gone back to verse 40. So there are many questions to be addressed. And some Adventists stood up a long time ago and said, this is what I think these verses mean. And it's just these 3 verses, really. 3 steps. And a group of us said we like that interpretation. It makes sense to us. And we ended up calling that person the first angel. But what I want us to see is that anybody should be able to go into those verses and see what he could see. Which is that there are 3 steps. There's a power that's rising, and they're going to rise in 3 steps. So I think that's the first witness. We could then go and see what Elder Jeff's interpretation of those 3 steps was. And see if you agree or disagree. Is the glorious land the Adventist Church? Is it this movement? Is it the United States? Is Egypt in verse 42 the same as the king of the south in verse 40? And this movement had spent, I would say, hundreds of hours discussing verse 40. And try to understand how that verse works. Because the verse itself can have various meanings. So when you go to approach these verses, How do you know what they mean? The Millerites looked at those verses and they said they mean this. And we say, actually, it means something quite different. Why have the Millerites and us come to different conclusions on these verses? One second. Go ahead. So someone said they use different methodology or different understanding. Someone said they use different methodology. I thought they used Miller's methodology, which is what we borrowed from them. So I'd say that they use the same methodology. Someone said? The principle of dispensationalism. So if we go with that and say that the Millerites were living in at which ray mark were the Millerites living in? The middle one, the present. And so they see things happening and they're going to go to these 3 steps and try to explain them. So that's the methodology that they used. And they came with one conclusion. Now we live in 200 years in the future. We're using exactly the same methodology. We're looking at present events and trying to understand them in the framework of these, I'm going to say these 3 verses. So it's easy to look at the Millerites' work and say, oh, look at the mistakes that they made. But I want us to see that based upon these rules, they're pretty much forced to make the decisions or the conclusions that they made. You've got no other option, really. So if we agree, hopefully, that that is our first witness, and its strength is in the structure of 3 steps. And even if you don't know what the symbols mean, you know it's speaking about one power. One thing I really liked about Elder Terry's presentations this weekend, is when she went through the Bible verses, she said, check the pronouns. Which is what we used to do. We used to pay very close attention. And in these 3 verses, it's really easy to do. Because you can see it's the same person being spoken of from 40, 41 into 42. So now we've got our first witness. Everybody can see it's 3 steps of the rise of a power. And it clearly says it all begins at the time of the end. Now, this movement has developed a theory, a model of what all of that means. That takes you from 1989 to the close of probation. So we've done all of those 6 verses and into Daniel 12. So we're not going to discuss that. We're going to say we now have a first witness that speaks about the rise of a power that does so in 3 steps, and it's happening today. I think that's how we should build witnesses. Because anybody, whatever your persuasion is, whatever your religious belief is, you don't even have to be a Christian. You can see that in those words. We've taken it one step further and explained, I'm going to say all the symbols. And then what do? We've got these 3 steps. We're going to say what it means. Now you have to go to other models or other histories to try to defend or explain this story. Defend it, not explain it. Defend it, not explain it. So then you have to take Isaiah 46 and you have to put yourself into another history. You have to become another person. A good one to choose is a prophet, because prophets tend to be raised up at important points in history. Ellen White calls them turning points. So that's relatively easy because most of the Bible is, I say most of the Bible is written by prophets who discuss important events. So having said all of that, I'll try to reproduce what Elder Terry, what her boardwork was. I'm going to do it backwards, if I can say that. So this is the, I call this Daniel 11. We have the time of the end. And then we have 3 steps. 2 more. So we believe that this is 1989, and I don't think there's any controversy in that amongst us. And this is the fight between the Soviet Union and the USA. So that's verse 40, and the next verse says the glorious land. And then the next verse says Egypt. So we're all in agreement, even the person who's asked the question, that this is the USA and this is the world. And maybe we need to be a bit more specific to define what the world means. But we can just leave it at that symbol for the moment. So after this fight between the Soviet Union and the United States is finished, then we'll call it the King of the North and the King of the South. The King of the South, after dealing with, so the King of the North, after dealing with the King of the South, then turns its attention to the Glorious Land, or the USA. And we call that the Sunday Law. Now, don't think there's any disagreement in that. So if you go to the Time of the End magazine, or most presentations that you've ever heard, it says by the time you get to this, which is verse 41, the King of the South is dead. Because after dealing with the King of the South, now the King of the North will deal with the United States. After completely destroying the United States, we'll call this the close of probation. Then the King of the North is going to turn its attention to the world. So I'm going to just say that the Glorious Land is now dead. Now, the problem with doing these lines like this is it teaches a certain truth. I'm going to say that it's correct, because that's what these verses teach. But we recognized a long time ago that some of these events occur concurrently at the same time. So that can bring confusion when you see what's happening in the present. But we'll leave that as it is. We have one more waymark, which we call the second advent. And that's when the controversy ends, at least on this planet. So Elder Terry developed this first witness in her study this weekend. But she's just repeating what is in the Time of the End magazine and what everybody here believes and accepts. But then she said, let's find some witnesses to this, some other witnesses. And these were not new. She took us back to studies that have been done a long time ago. She took us to two stories. Pagan Rome. And then she took us to papal Rome. So she's going to give us two witnesses. So the questioner asked, do you have other witnesses? And so they're the two witnesses that she gave. So I know the questioner and I know that they're intelligent. So I'm not sure exactly what they're asking in that question. So I'm sure they would have seen all of this. Which leads me to think that maybe we see the use or the term of witnesses differently. Which is why I spent a long time, because Elder Terry gave the answer within about 30 seconds. So I'm just going to repeat what she did. Pagan Rome the story begins in 64 BC. It then goes on to 63 BC. And then it goes on to 31 BC. And all of these three dates aren't new. If you've looked at old studies or you're familiar with them, all of these are well-established dates and the story is well-established. So the way we tell the story, which is how she told the story, where in all of these stories do you begin to rule? I know I've jumped ahead. Where do we mark rulership? At which waymark? We've got 4 waymarks. Shout out the number. Everybody agree number 3? Yeah. So we'll put a crown here. That's where we mark complete rulership. So what is confusing people, I'm suggesting, not only today, but in the last few years, our focus has been on a very specific piece of history. The present. And it's this little bit of history here without defining what the beginning is. And we've spoken about the fall of the sixth and the rise of the seventh kingdom. And the way we have taught that, it sounds like what? What does it sound like when we talk about, oh, this crown here, that kingdom, what number is that? What's the name of that kingdom? So this is number 7. But what have we been teaching in the movement for a few years now? It's more than a few years. It predates Elder Tess's arrival. This history, what do we teach? About the seventh kingdom. Sorry? Begins at the Sunday law. Anybody want to describe it a different way? Speak loud. So we've done things like this for the 7th and the 6th. And when you do things like that, what settles in your mind is that that crown isn't here, but it's here. Does that make sense? So if you look at most studies that are happening at the moment, I said that this rise and fall of the 6th and 7th predated Elder Tess's studies, and it did. But like many other studies that we did in the past, she developed that, that idea, that model. She reinforced and established it to such a degree that I think in our consciousness, we've placed this crown one way mark earlier. And we can't say that that's wrong. Elder Terry, do you have a mic? So Elder Terry's just added something. Hope that's spelt correct. And this is Julius Caesar. Is that EA? ER? AR? So this is Julius Caesar, who is elected as Pontifex Maximus at this waymark. So all I'm saying is, when we taught the seventh kingdom comes to its pinnacle at, we'll call it the Sunday law. And Elder Tess develops and confirms that in her studies. and therefore it becomes a truth that's well established in our consciousness, what I want to say is all of that is true. And what Elder Terry just added here wasn't just some thought that she invented now. She already knows that. So all I'm saying is there is a validity to move the crown here. But it's not the end of the story. So you have to take 3 territories, 3 nations, 3 horns. And then you rule. And she gave us the date for that rulership. AD 330. And that's 360 years or a time. So we could really stop there because we have now one witness, which we know is accurate to history and prophecy. But she gave a second one because it has all the same elements. You have the Heruli, Vandals, and the Goths or Ostrogoths, depending on how you want to say it. Three horns. Then you get the same model. This is AD 1798. And this is 3.5 times. Or 1260. So once you have these witnesses, what can you then do? What do you want to do? What's the purpose of all of this? Someone said over here? They're witness, but what are you trying to understand? What's your purpose? One second. Go ahead. What is the point you're trying to make? Okay, I'll go with that. Someone else? Pattern? So what I would suggest, we've got events happening. We want to try to understand the events. And we see in these verses something that leads us to understand that these verses are talking about the events that are happening now. Some Adventist stands up and says, I think it means this, what we've drawn on the board. We say it sounds good, but we need to prove that it's correct. So we go to 2 different stories that we noticed have all the same properties. The properties is 3 steps. Plus rulership. So once you've developed these, what you can then do is go back to the story that you want to understand and fill in some gaps. Or be certain about what your initial thesis, or I don't want to call it a guess, but your initial thesis was, your initial idea. For instance, is the glorious land the church or a country? So it may not be that straightforward to understand that. Because in ancient Israel, they were the same thing. And that's why when you try to understand the symbology today, it could become confusing. But if you take the storyline, you'll see that it is about geography. So that's something that we can now be sure about. And we can be sure about the King of the North, how that operates. And we know when the rulership begins and ends. So the question was about the death of the King of the South. Did you want to say anything more, Elder Terry, that's on there? The death of the King of the South, other witnesses. Mic? Just the mic? Oh.
Yes, that study is just bones. There is detail on the Ptolemaic kingdom, what shared. It's subjugated in 63. Of course, you know, no history.
So I just asked Elder Terry, did you want to add anything? And what she just explained was the following. That if you take the story of pagan Rome, because it has Egypt, literal Egypt, and I don't want to call it symbolic Egypt, but that there's symbology attached to all of that, of course. Because while it's the literal country, it's also Greece. It's the last remnants of Greece. Are people familiar with that? I think Elder Terry mentioned that in her studies. That Greece ends up dividing into 2 parts, north and south. The Seleucid Empire in the north and the Ptolemaic Empire in the south. And Rome has to deal with both. So I had King of the North here. So that was the Seleucid Empire. And what's so good about this witness, when we used to teach it, and she reminded us of this, And I think we forget this. We think this is all about MAGA, which means it's all about America. But in the story of pagan Rome, it's not about the glorious land. It's about destroying Greece prophetically or destroying Egypt literally. And the only way you can do that logistically is to go through the glorious land. And you remember that over here, she drew a map. Same map that we used to draw in numerous presentations. In this story, the focus is at the end here. And I'm not saying our focus shouldn't be at the US Sunday law. But the story is about this final step. The one thing we know, but I think we've forgotten, is our whole idea about this history here. I'm going to say is distorted. Because we don't call that rulership, do we? If we went to this history this time, we'd say this would be the glory days of Rome, of the papacy. But we call this what? We call this the time of trouble, don't we? And we say the glory days of the King of the North have come to its end here. So, to answer the question, I think other witnesses were given. I think there is an acknowledgement that we have to deal with these two steps. And what I didn't write here, but Elder Terry said, even though we say this is the end of Ptolemy here, or the Ptolemaic Empire, let's put it that way, because Ptolemy isn't ruling then. But there is engagement with Ptolemy, with his empire, way before here in Egypt. It's happening in this history too. Yep. The struggle between Rome and Egypt, as Rome, the fourth kingdom, destroys Greece, the third kingdom. Doesn't all just happen at this one battle in 31. This has been going on for decades, and you can show clear history in the 63 history that there is a struggle between these two powers. So if you know that history, you can then show that there is in fact an interaction between the king of the north and the king of the south at the waymark that we call Sunday law, the end of verse 41. Okay, so another question. Since when do we mark the death of the king of the south, both internally and externally? Hasn't the death of the king of the south always been in relation to the king of the north? So are you able to comment on that? Before you do, if you explain to people what the questioner means, internal, external, death of the king of the south. So I'll just repeat what she says because we'll run out of time. When we discuss the king of the south, we go ahead. We can compare that king with the king of the north. Because they're completely opposite, they're also the same. They share the same characteristics. So we could go through this same discussion, but talking about those two kings. And once you can establish multiple witnesses about a particular subject, you can borrow information from one model and lay it on top of another model. Just like we did here, and we put the word rule. So you can compare and contrast the two kings. The question says, we've never looked at an internal death before, and Elder Terry's answer so far we may not have focused on that before, but let's compare and contrast with the north.
So the king of the north title is within and external. King of the south has the same dynamic.
So we all know by now, when we speak about what the king of the north needs to do, it needs to also enter into the glorious land and then move on to Egypt. It's on the board. So this grey mark here that says Sunday law, if we call this the USA Sunday law, and we call this the worldwide Sunday law, then the king of the north is taking down or subjugating the glorious land, United States. Another piece of evidence that Elder Terry shared with us was this story here. So we know that this story ends here and this one begins here. But she took those two waymarks and lined them up. Remember, she did that. And that's nothing new. Took us to Revelation 13 and spoke about the rise and fall of nations. So who's falling? I don't want to use the term King of the North. Papacy. And who's rising? The USA. Now, she went into a lot of detail in the symbology to demonstrate that. So, as soon as you know that, I'm working backwards, by the way, because what you're supposed to do is work in the present, see what happens, or see what's happening, work out a witness, which comes your first, and then look for a historical second witness. And those historical ones should almost always be prophetic as well. So we can do the same here. So I know I did that as number 1 and 2, but it's the other way round. If we're going to talk in terms of witnesses. So if we're okay with that, you need that information, because people in the movement, some, have a misunderstanding about the role of the papacy at the end of the world. But I'm not addressing that, but this model explains that issue. Why do we need to know this? What does this tell us? This is about the question, remember? We need to pick up some information here to use it to answer this question. This model here, what's the title? Or the subject matter? It's a story about whom? So the conclusion of that study would be what? In our history, the King of the North is whom? USA. I don't think we had clarity on that in our early development in this movement. The reason we didn't is, I'm going to say threefold issue, but it's Ellen White's writings speaks about a threefold union. It's Elder Jeff's understanding of these verses. And it's I'll say collectively, Adventism's understanding of Revelation, most of Revelation, but at least 12, 13, and 17. I don't think it's new to say that the King of the North is the United States. But I think we needed reminding of that. Because people have been confused about how you get from verse 40 to 41 and magically the King of the North changed from the papacy to America. And it wasn't magical. So once you know this, that the King of the North is the United States, what does it mean about this battle? He shall also enter into the glorious land. I'll call it an Adventist model. I don't know exactly what they believe. But this is not Catholicism getting involved in the United States and making them have a Sunday law. Forget the Sunday bit. It's not an external power coming to destroy America. Because we know it's the King of the North that does that destructive work. And who is that? Who is the King of the North? We've already defined it here. So the aggressor is the United States. And who's the victim? United States. So the United States is fighting with the United States. So we can call that a civil war, or the term that Elder Terry used, internal. So if we're okay with that, then we move on to this story, the next one. After America has destroyed America and won, it will then move on to take the world, or Egypt. Am I okay to put, with respect to this one, to put internal and external? Is that okay? So Elder Terry said compare and contrast. If the King of the North has an internal issue to deal with and an external one, she's saying the King of the South does. And the question says, since when did we do that? The answer is as of yesterday. If you didn't see it before, it's not something new. It's just something that people haven't noticed. Elder Terry. So the story of Navalny, which Elder Terry is marking as the internal, we'll call it the internal death. Even though Elder Tess had mentioned this person and their role in Russia, she may not have defined it in the way that it's being defined now. But Elder Terry is saying she didn't just pluck up this story by herself. She didn't make this, she didn't create this story by herself. She borrowed it from Elder Tess. But what she has done is taken a news story about someone significant in Russia and seen that as a turning point. So, is that fair enough? So, to answer the question, we haven't always looked at an internal death of the King of the South. And the death of the King of the South may always have been in relation to the King of the North. So I want to just take those two thoughts and if we see that there's an internal and external, and even if you're not yet persuaded, at least if you consider now that they're, go ahead. That there's the potential legitimacy of requiring an internal and external death of the King of the South, you can see a prophetic argument for that. And you can see it being laid out over Daniel 11. So for sure, it may be a new idea. But just because it's new doesn't mean it's wrong. And maybe it's just something that we haven't noticed. What we're required to do is look at the integrity of this line as it's being drawn. We all know that this is the internal death of America. We'd call it civil war. That's why it's internal. And the question is, should we expect something similar in Russia, the King of the South? And I think the reason why people are struggling is because the Time of the End magazine seems to indicate that the death happens at this way mark, number 2. And the result of that death is at the hands of the king of the north. And I think even though Elder Terry didn't take the time to explain that, you can have a narrative to show that. So the democratic fall of the king of the south is not a subject of prophecy on its own. Maybe I'm going to answer that. Maybe I'll answer that one. Who says it isn't? Who says the internal fall of the Soviet Union is not a subject of prophecy? Just because we haven't seen it up to this point. Go ahead. So, Elder Terry is an answer for that one. The democratic fall of the king of the south is not a subject of Bible prophecy. And she took us back to 1989, reminding us all again that that was an internal fall of the king of the south. Okay, so hopefully that's answered. I'll quickly try and do more. I know we've run out of time. What do you mark as the beginning of the Sunday law waymark and the end? So I presume that means this waymark and this one, the beginning and the end. Which is waymark number 2 and 3. What's the marker for with respect to the king of the actually, so it says, what do you mark as the beginning of the Sunday law waymark? So I guess the Sunday. So I guess the Sunday law would then, I think the target is the king of the north. We'll do both. From the perspective of the king of the north, how do we mark this Sunday law? July 18? The RNC? And the king of the south? What would you write here? What would be the marker? The death of? Okay. I don't know how to spell his name. EY? Say it. NAV. Okay. And the Munich? I know this is small for people online. I'll take a picture and post it. So people can look at these two and find out details about that. So that's where Elder Terry's marking the beginning. And the end? We can't say with any, it's the future. We don't know what the future would actually specifically look like. We can't predict an event. Say it again, we won't know that till. So when it comes to the king of the north and the king of the south, we can't make any commitment. And there's a prophetic reason for that. She says that the loud cry, she used the word formalization. We'll be able to see the end. So we can't define what the end is yet. Well, she can't. On the line of the Heruli, Vandals, and Goths, don't we mark the Sunday law at the third way mark, 538, and the close of probation at 1798? That model that he's speaking of, do you see it as a contradiction to anything that you've said? So Elder Terry agrees with that statement, that explanation. This is 538. And this is indeed the Sunday law. Then it says, and he shall come to his end. And so it's okay to put close of probation at that point too, or death. The question was close of probation for whom? So she's not going to take the time to, but Elder Terry can answer that specific question. It's not phasing her out in any way. And just so that I would just point out that if the question is marking Sunday law here, then they would agree that this would also be Sunday law. So don't like throwing questions back at people like that. But that's marked as close of probation. Therefore, this would also be a close of probation. And if we're not careful, we can end up tying ourselves into knots unnecessarily. And to me, this was the sort of the punchline of all of this. This is where the disagreements are. To make this application, what is this application? Which line? This one, Daniel 11. To make this application, shouldn't all the lines, like these ones, all be in agreement? Now, this is a rhetorical statement because the questioner doesn't believe that they are in agreement. And obviously, the only reason these were brought up by Elder Terry is because she believes that they are in agreement. So I wanted to spend this presentation discussing these questions because they touched on several issues. How a competent teacher in the movement can look at these lines and say they're not in agreement. And Elder Terry stood up and said, not only are they in agreement, but they're the defense of this line. So I know in one presentation, I've tried to be as open and transparent about this issue. So that everybody can see how different people see things. So the bottom line to me is, the bottom line of this questioner, all the questions that this person is asking, is they don't believe these lines are in agreement. And we've tried to work together in this study to see if, I'll call it an accusation, I can't think of a softer word, to see if that criticism is valid. So each of us listening needs to decide for ourselves where has Elder Terry gone wrong in these two lines, these two witnesses? And this related story here. So if you're on audio, pagan Rome, papal Rome, and the transfer of the title of the King of the North from the papacy to the United States. Have a look at what she's laid out and try to pinpoint where you believe the mistake is. I want to thank everybody for spending your valuable time with us. I hope you've enjoyed these studies as much as I have. I hope you've all been blessed. And if you're not educated, at least challenged. I hope at least some of your questions have been addressed, even if you don't like what the answers were. I know we're a little bit over time, but we're going to close with prayer. And as we close these series of meetings and we close our camp, we're going to have a congregational song. So I'm going to pray and switch the camera around. Then we'll sing and then we'll close the service. Let's pray. Holy God, we thank you We thank you for the methodology that you have given to us. For our ability to think independently. For the great privilege that you have given us to even challenge you. As we study your word, as we look at the events in the world today, help us to be able to apply the correct rules to understand what's happening. Help us to come into a clearer understanding of the truth. As we do that individually, we will come closer together. We thank you for this privilege. In Jesus' name, amen. So if everybody stays online, just going to change some settings. Just going to change some settings.